Hello and welcome back to part 2 of the lecture. So let's recap. Hobbes has identified 3 sources of conflict: competition, diffidence and glory. And it's fairly straightforward to see why competition and diffidence can be dealt with by establishing a central coercive power. One has less to fear from someone who will be punished by an all-powerful sovereign if they attack you or break their contracts. Similarly, coercion can alter people's deliberation in ways coercive to peace in the case of competition. I'll be less inclined to invade another person's goods in competition for resources if I think I won't escape with the stolen goods unpunished. So the problems of competition and diffidence can be solved fairly straightforwardly by establishing a central coercive power. Fear of a sovereign is insufficient, however, to solve the problem of glory, because, as Hobbes observes, men regularly show that they're willing to hazard their lives when pride is at stake. And of course, the English Civil War is for Hobbes just an illustration of that point. So because coercion is insufficient to solve the problem of glory, a second ideological prong of sovereignty is necessary. Hobbes argues that one of sovereignty's integral powers is the power to define the standard by which men are evaluated. You'll recall that the problem of glory arises because all men wish to be evaluated in the terms that they evaluate themselves. This gives rise to conflict when the terms of one man clash with the terms of another, when, if you like, I do not see you as giving me due recognition, or you don't see me as giving you due recognition. What Hobbes argues is necessary is an impartial sovereign power that can set the terms of recognition, that specifies the rules and norms according to what is just or unjust, what is honourable or dishonourable, are determined. That will establish a kind of common public rate at which people will be evaluated. In his earlier work, De Cive, Hobbes had written, "All disputes arise from the fact that men's opinion differ about mine and yours, just and unjust, good and bad, honourable and dishonourable, and so on, and everyone decides them by his own judgment. Consequently, it's the responsibility of the same sovereign to come up with rules or measures that will be common to all, and to publish them openly, so that each may know by them what he should call his own and what is another's, what he should call just and unjust, honourable and dishonourable, good and bad. In sum, what he should and what he should avoid doing in social life." The sovereign, then, requires absolute sovereignty not only to solve the problems of competition and diffidence, but more crucially, to establish the terms on which we speak and interact with each other, the definition of terms, the specification of what counts as good and evil, what counts as just and unjust, on what basis I can claim my conduct is honourable, or that your conduct is dishonourable. And for Hobbes, this central ability to, as if you like, define the terms of social life, to define the terms of the language in terms of which we interact with one another, is the crucial power of the sovereign. Because Hobbes sees disputes between men over glory as fundamentally arising from problems of using words in different ways. And a nice example of this, central to Hobbes' concern, are words like freedom. So for the Republicans fighting in the English Civil War against Charles I's royalists, freedom essentially meant being free from the arbitrary power of the sovereign, free from, as it were, the whim or decisions of the sovereign. To be subject to law meant precisely for Republicans to be free from that such arbitrary power. For Hobbes, by contrast, freedom just means the inability of another person to interfere with your actions. It may seem that those two ideas of freedom are close, but they're really importantly different. And a way to illustrate this is to consider the case of the slave. So, for Republicans, a slave is unfree. And he's unfree even if his master never interferes with his actions, even if he has a benign master who leaves him alone to do what he will. For Republicans, what matters is precisely that the master could at any point, if he chose to, interfere with the slave's action, even if the master never makes that choice. For Hobbes, by contrast, the slave is free as long as the master doesn't interfere. The fact that the master could interfere at some point is neither here nor there. Now, Hobbes's idea here is that when we redefine freedom, or when we specify freedom simply in terms of interference or the absence of interference, it removes from our public political debates arguments around what is arbitrary, okay? Whether, as it were, the power to interfere, which sovereigns such as Charles I had and could exercise, is really a constraint on one's freedom or not. So Hobbes saw the Republican view of freedom as being one of the sources that led to the English Civil War. By redefining it in, as it were, objective terms, is there interference, is there not interference, Hobbes seeks to establish the argument for sovereignty that he sees as undermining the sources of conflict that lead to such wars. In the frontispiece for Leviathan that Hobbes designed, we see the figure of the sovereign, the figure of the Leviathan, rising up above the hills with his sword and his scepter, so both the power of coercion and the power of religion, of setting the terms of social life, above a kind of prosperous city with its church spire. Now, what's important for us here is to remember that Hobbes named the sovereign Leviathan, the mortal god, in order to represent the sense of someone who overawes the children of pride, that is, human beings. We can see this more closely if we look in detail at the body of the sovereign. It may be a little hard to see it, despite the blow-up I've tried to provide. But the body of the sovereign is made up of all the people who engage in the social compact, all the people, as it were, who have led the state of nature in contracting to obey the sovereign. And particularly important is the fact, which it may be particularly hard to see, is that they are all facing upwards towards the sovereign's face, that they are all looking up towards the kind of crowned head of the sovereign, that they are, as it were, in a relationship of awe. So the sovereign, the Leviathan, is made up of the people. This is important for a reason we'll come to shortly. But they are at the same time looking up at the head of the Leviathan as it were, standing above and over them, as it were, a site of worship, if you like, in a sense, as a relation in which they stand in awe of the sovereign. Now, I mentioned that the Leviathan is made up of the people of the sovereign, the people who have contracted to leave the nasty, short and brutish prospects of life in the state of nature, to enter into civil society and to, as it were, stand under the sovereign. And Hobbes argues that in contracting together to constitute this sovereign who stands above them, the people have authorized the sovereign to act on their behalf. What that means for Hobbes is that the acts of the sovereigns are your acts. You can't, as it were, disavow the acts of the sovereign. You can't say, not in my name or not in our name, because the acts of the sovereign have been authorized by you. The sovereign acts on your behalf. This does not mean that there are kind of that the sovereigns, although their sovereignty is absolute, can legitimately demand anything of you at all. That's because you contracted in order to leave the state of nature, in order to escape the kind of fear of imminent death that characterized that realm. So Hobbes argues that the sovereign can't legitimately require you, for example, to give evidence against yourself in court if that would lead to your execution. Okay? So there are some limits on what the sovereign can demand. These are very limited in their character and typically involve, the prospect of death for you. But there are some limits to what the sovereign can demand. There are also some limits to what the sovereign should demand. Although the sovereign may have power to and authority to take your property, to steal your, wife or husband, to take on your children, to sort of confiscate your children, there are kind of prudential reasons why the sovereign should not act in those ways, because that's likely to generate what Hobbes calls natural rebellion, where we basically forget about the sort of rational basis on which we've constituted the sovereign and our obligations to obey, and lose our rationality, lose our temper, and seek to rebel. Our emotions overcome us. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with an argument for an absolute sovereign, for a sovereign whose powers cannot be limited by being divided between a legislative, executive, or judiciary, but for a sovereign who can rule society and secure it against internal and external threats. And that's the core of Hobbes's argument in his book, Leviathan.